I'm going to talk about a killer disease that I'm going to suggest no one knows, although I think you probably may know it by other names. And this particular disease kills more Australians than breast cancer or prostate cancer or colon cancer, cervical cancer, or who die in road traffic accidents. I'm going to let you think over the next few minutes because I'm just going to go off topic for a little while and give you a little update about Wesley Medical Research while you're in the background thinking what disease, and it's got a specific name, kills more than all of those conditions. Well, one thing that I think, as Claire has suggested and many of you know, is that we have had quite a realignment of our activities at Wesley Medical Research, such that we now have 7 specific clinical themes. And I'm going to run through those just very briefly and just give you some flavour of the sort of research that we're undertaking. So one of our key themes is neuroscience. And I guess once this talk finishes, you'll be going off home to have a good sleep. But you also know what a crummy old day you have if you don't sleep. And I'd like to introduce and embarrass Dr. Susie Mantovani, who's at the back, who is now famous in all of the Italian-speaking community in Australia because she's just done an SBS live interview on her research, which is on the effects of sleep on patients with neurologic conditions. So you could imagine someone with Parkinson's disease or many neurologic conditions, it's hard enough in their waking hours, let alone this impact of adverse sleep, which has on their lives. So that's Susie's major research program, and I've said this to Susie that over the next 5 or 10 years, she will undoubtedly really be one of the world leaders in this area of research across the world. Many of you will know Dr. Julie Todd Hunter, who has led the way here at Wesley Medical Research in conducting trials on new therapies for multiple sclerosis. And Julie, I know when the patients, well, they typically do not walk straight in, they use some sort of walking aid, and Julie has been performing really groundbreaking research on some brand new drugs which are being trialled for multiple sclerosis, and that has really been, there's a revolution in multiple sclerosis treatment occurring at the moment. And then, as many of you know, Mr. Lynn Brazel gave a donation of $5 million to support our research in motor neurone disease. And this program is moving very rapidly with one particularly interesting theme, and that is the effect of what you eat on motor neurone disease. I think many of you know that motor neurone disease may have a life expectancy often of 12 or 18 months, and yet it's one of these diseases where it's better to be fat than thin. The fatter you are, the longer you survive from motor neurone disease. So I think we've got some dietitians in the audience who, but we also have another sort of twist to that, in that we are investigating a compound called WMR001, which is a compound that one of our board members actually discovered, which is a natural product which may actually have a significant effect on what's happening in the intestines of patients with motor neurone disease, and may actually, it waits to be seen, but may have an effect on survival in motor neurone disease. I'll just briefly run through these other themes. So cardiology, many of you know that Wesley Medical Research does not just look after Wesley Hospital, but also St Andrew's Hospital. And we've got a large team who analyse data that comes from Wesley Hospital and St Andrew's Hospital. St Andrew's has the logo that basically there's world-class care and world-class results, and that is as a result of the data that we've generated that shows that outcomes after a heart attack or a cardiac procedure at St Andrews are as good as anywhere in the world. Cancer is another clear and important theme, and as I mentioned, Emma is undertaking research on a new ovarian cancer drug which has just commenced. Women's and children's health, clearly breast cancer here at Wesley is an important focus, and also diseases of children. And one of our colleagues here, Colin Myers, is one of the world's leaders in pronouncing one of these very rare disorders. Exactly. Thank you, Colin. So, unfortunately, as Professor Pern knows, some of these very rare diseases have got very incredibly difficult names. And Colin has, for the last 2 years, been talking about our particular project in this rare condition. And thank you, Colin. Infections and critical illness. This is something I'll talk about later. The advent of antibiotic resistance and how that's going to threaten so many of the other advances that we've been talking about today. And finally, rural and remote health. I might just briefly ask you, what do you think when we've done surveys of people in rural parts of Queensland, what is their number one health concern? Any thoughts?
Mental health issues.
Exactly. Mental health issues. I thought it might have been diabetes or heart disease, but far and away mental health is number one. And we have a group of researchers who are very involved in particularly organisations that work in rural parts of Queensland and addressing mental health issues. All right. And finally, we shouldn't forget the surgical innovation theme that Professor Russell Stitz runs the research committee of. And this looks at a variety of conditions that are treated surgically, one of which is prostate cancer. One of our board members gave us this from the US Airways magazine, and it said, Stanford Hospital prostate MRI. In fact, the prostate MRI, as those of you who've been around at the Advocates events for a while will know, was actually developed here at the Wesley Hospital and funded by Wesley Medical Research. And yet now it's something that has taken off internationally. All right. Well, I mentioned at the beginning that this particular condition kills more Australians than any of these conditions. Now, who's going to help me by telling me what this particular condition is called? Any thoughts? I always help my patients with crosswords. I know all the bones of the inner ear, not because they're of any medical interest, but because they're always a crossword clue. So this has got 6 letters. Exactly, sepsis. Sepsis. Now, septicemia, sepsis. Now, I'm going to explain what this is. But firstly, just to give you a little bit of personal background, I worked at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center for 10 years. And while there, I had a wonderful opportunity to travel. And this is not me, I just found it on the internet today. But you can see this, lovely scene in the background. But it does have a degree of similarity with this disease called sepsis. Because here you can see this river is quite calm, really. But this is the Niagara River. And not too far down from there, well, a little way, is the Niagara Falls. And this is the situation that patients are in when they have sepsis. They start getting sick, but once it reaches a critical point, really there is just about no turning back. So it is an incredibly important condition. And both for the lay community, but also, of course, for the medical community, recognition of sepsis is something that saves lives, because there is clear data now that within every hour after the onset of sepsis, a delay in getting appropriate antibiotics increases your mortality. So overall, in patients with sepsis who come to hospital, 14% die. Now, if you have a heart attack and come to hospital, 8% of people die. So it's a condition that, people have heard of septicemia. It's a little bit different from septicemia. It's not spot-on septicemia, but it is a condition that has a huge impact on people's lives. Now, these are the symptoms of sepsis. So I always ask patients if they've had real shivers, really bad shaking chills gets you in the ballpark. Extreme pain or discomfort all over you, just feel like, everything's aching. Now, obviously those first two things, if you had a bad case of the flu, you could have those. You have pallor, you've got pale and discoloured skin. You may be sleepy, difficult to wake up, confused when you're woken. There's often a sense of impending doom. I feel like I might die. And finally, people typically are also quite short of breath. So I doubt that there's ever been any sort of public campaigns about sepsis, and often it's triggered by a particular infection. So, for example, Professor Stitz may have had patients who've had abdominal pain as the precursor to these symptoms as a general surgeon. Or someone may have had symptoms of a urinary tract infection, which then progresses to sepsis. So, as I mentioned, it's a big killer. So 6,500 people die in Australia each year. So divided by 365, that's 10 to 20 patients die, or people die each year, or die each day from sepsis, and that's much more significant than many of our common cancers. And as I mentioned, the death rate is just walking in the door with sepsis, 14% of people die. So in such a critical condition, one of the key points about treatment of it is resuscitation. In other words, people need to have intravenous fluids and they need to have oxygen. Sometimes these people with sepsis need to go, well, typically they need to go to the intensive care unit and have artificial mechanical ventilation. Last week I found out from the director of the Wesley Hospital ICU that the world's largest study on sepsis had just completed enrolment. That was more than 4,000 patients with sepsis. The lead hospital on that study was actually the Wesley Hospital. So Dr. Bala Venkatesh, who's the director of ICU here, got funding from the Australian government, several $1 million. Unfortunately, it was beyond our ability to fund this particular project, but its aim was to see whether the administration of steroids actually makes a difference to the survival of people with sepsis. So this has been something that's been controversial. It's not the Ben Johnson steroids, it's more things like prednisone, cortisone. So again, I think an aspect that most people have had very little knowledge of. And finally, antibiotics. And so I'm going to finish by talking a little bit about antibiotics. And some of you will have heard this, some of this before. This is a road in Bolivia called the Road of Death. But if you're in hospital with sepsis and then it is found that the germ that you have is resistant to the antibiotics that were given to you, you have a much higher chance of dying than 14%. It's probably 40 or 50%. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So we all know about Florey, the Australian who won the Nobel Prize for the development of penicillin. It was Fleming who discovered penicillin, but it was Florey who developed it. And I've told some of you before about my patient who grew up in Mackay in the 1940s, who showed me a letter that her father wrote to the captain who was involved, who was leading the US Army base in Mackay. And the letter was basically pleading for the captain to release penicillin to the Mackay base hospital so my patient, who was at that time 6 or 7, could have access to antibiotics. Otherwise, she would have died. And so it's amazing that perhaps even some of you here today maybe are only here today because you had access to antibiotics as a child. And so it really has been an incredible innovation. Susie, who I introduced you to before, is from Italy. This is a photograph from Sardinia, and they call this the Emerald Coast, beautiful water. But in the 1940s, after World War II, this water used to be murky and brown, and the reason for that is that, unfortunately, raw sewage was just pumped into that water. But an Italian microbiologist looked out and saw there were some clear patches in the water. He cultured that, and it grew a fungus. Now, it wasn't the penicillium fungus that led to the discovery of penicillin. It was a fungus called Cephalosporium. And those of you who have been involved in medicine or have received antibiotics would undoubtedly have received things like Keflex or other similar antibiotics. There's a similar sort of one intravenously. And that was all from this quite fortuitous discovery in Italy. This whole new class of antibiotics was developed. Unfortunately, our bacteria have started to get resistant to these cephalosporin antibiotics. Now, one mode of resistance is MRSA, which interestingly used to be endemic in hospitals in Queensland, meaning that if you came into hospital, broke your leg, you may well have got MRSA infection. Now, MRSA is extremely rare in our hospitals, but what we do find is that most MRSA, when we see it today, is actually what we call community acquired, meaning that it's acquired outside of hospital and then the person gets sick from this MRSA germ. There are sort of two big breeds of antibiotics. It's sort of like whether you like dogs or cats. MRSA is one lot, it's the dogs. My personal research is on the cats, which are called the gram-negative bacteria. Things like, there's one called Pseudomonas. And these are nasty because they are the type of bacteria that is now becoming resistant to almost all antibiotics. And this is some projections showing that by 2050, close to, or you can see the number of deaths. For example, in Asia, 4 million people dying a year purely attributable to the antibiotic resistance, not just the bacterial infection, but the antibiotic resistance. So this is going to be a major global health problem. And recently, the World Economic Forum got together. They said there were 3 major issues to our current way of life: global warming, terrorism, and antibiotic resistance. So it really is now starting to get to the top of the political stage. One of the problems as to why we have had such significant antibiotic resistance is that in the past, pharmaceutical companies used to step in and develop a new antibiotic, and therefore what was resistant to the old one would be saved by the new one. But with the global financial crisis, almost all of the big pharmaceutical companies got out of antibiotic discovery and development. And so it was left to the little tiddlers, little startup companies that actually came out of universities to develop new antibiotics. I don't know much about stocks and shares, but I don't think this one is a great buy. And this is the share price of a company from late last year that was developing a new antibiotic, and it failed its clinical trial, and that's the end of that company. So we're lucky in Australia in that our rates of resistance to antibiotics have been lower than many other parts of the world. This is sort of a heat map, and if it's red, it's the highest rates of resistance. Luckily for many, Australia is still in the green, but that's rapidly changing. And so we shouldn't think that we're immune to this threat of antibiotic resistance. And part of the reason for that is, of course, international air travel. So yesterday, for example, I looked after a patient in the intensive care unit at St Andrew's Hospital who had just come back after being 3 weeks in hospital in France. And, you know, in the twinkling of an eye, you can be sick in one part of the world and back here in another. And this has been studied by looking at people before and after they went overseas. And in this particular study, maybe if you look at this one, ciprofloxacin, which is a particular antibiotic, they cultured people before they went overseas, and only 3% had antibiotic resistance to that particular antibiotic. When they got back from overseas, 1/3 of people had resistance to that antibiotic. So it is, travel overseas is an issue. Now, it's not necessarily a practical issue because everyone's got bacteria in their intestines, and it's not the end of the world if they become resistant to antibiotics. However, if you get a urinary tract infection, or at that time you need abdominal surgery, and you have one of these antibiotic resistant bacteria in your system, you are then much more likely to get a serious infection with something that's quite nasty and resistant. We need to realise that part of the issues overseas are the huge amounts of antibiotic being administered to animals. And you can see here that livestock probably get 3/4 of the tonnage of antibiotics. So the bacteria in the intestines of the animals that are fed the antibiotics become resistant to the antibiotics. Unfortunately, in meat preparation, there's contamination of that meat. When we ingest the meat, we can ingest the animal's antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Now, you might say, well, I cook my meat really well, and you're not going to be eating hamburgers like this every day. But if you go to a function and you don't know how the food's been prepared, has there been good kitchen hygiene, have things been well cooked? And certainly when you're travelling overseas, you don't really have a lot of conception of these particular issues. What's worst is that an antibiotic which was actually developed in 1959, colistin, but then went off the market for probably 20 years because it was so toxic. It would make your kidneys fail when you got it. We've had to bring it back in recent years to treat superbugs. However, if you go to China or India, they're feeding it to chooks because they don't want their chooks to get superbugs. But the problem then is if we eat poultry in those countries, it's typically with a colistin-resistant bacteria. And so this vicious cycle is really quite significant. Those antibiotics and antibiotic-resistant bacteria can get into water. This is a map of New Delhi, and if you can see a W, that's where tap water in New Delhi was found to have superbugs. So visiting various parts of the world, you may actually be ingesting these very resistant bacteria. So what can we do about this problem? So my career at the moment is very much looking at, can we resurrect old antibiotics and trial them against new antibiotics? So I'm soon to come to the end of a trial called the Merino trial. It was a study I started about 4 years ago in Australia and New Zealand, and then someone said to me, oh, you should go to Singapore because they're great researchers. But then I thought, how can I call it the Merino trial if we've got Singapore, because they don't have sheep in Singapore. But we ended up expanding it to Singapore and Saudi Arabia and Italy and Turkey. So it's been a 9-country study which is soon to come to an end, trying to see whether an old antibiotic is actually as good as some of the new ones. So can we resurrect old antibiotics to use against superbugs? I'm currently designing a study which we've called the Game Changer study. And this is a study of a new antibiotic which has been discovered in Japan. And it's a novel concept in that the antibiotic acts like a Trojan horse. So every bacteria actually needs iron to survive. And this antibiotic gets in through the iron transport pathways into the bacteria. So it sneaks in through these channels. And people would say, well, surely the bacteria can get clever and switch off these pathways. Well, if it does, the bacteria can't get any iron and so it's going to die. So this new Japanese antibiotic, which I call sort of the Trojan horse antibiotic, could really be a game changer and could be one that might be revolutionary in terms of our ability to fight some of these superbugs. I mentioned that sometimes we get travellers from overseas. My patient from France was telling me about her trips to various art galleries in France, and this is a lovely painting from the Louvre. But the unfortunate thing is, if we get patients to this hospital or St Andrews who've been overseas, we actually do a little swab to see if they have one of these superbugs. So that's one of our infection control measures. And another measure, how did we get to this degree of positivity in Australia? Historically, doctors in Australia have had to ring up the government, the federal government, to get access to certain antibiotics. There's this authority scheme. And that's been useful and has now been extrapolated to other scenarios. So in hospitals now, we actually get doctors to call the infection doctors to get approval for certain high-strength antibiotics because we need to restrict those only to the patients who really need them. And you can see in that example, this is, I won't go into details, this is usage and this is resistance. And luckily in this example, Australia is in a very, very nice position. The trouble is that now that antibiotic has gone what we call generic, so it's much cheaper. And so I'm finding that doctors are deciding, I'm not going to ring up the government, because when you ring up the government, it actually gets a very cheap price for the patient. But now it's just as cheap if you don't ring the government. And so unfortunately our usage of that particular antibiotic is increasing. I think Russell and John knows that if doctors can get out of paperwork, having to make an extra phone call, we'll do it. So there are 2 other key interventions. I'd like to introduce Alison Farrington, who's towards the back of our audience. Alison has been doing a study called the REACH study, which is a partnership between Wesley Medical Research and the NHMRC, the main funding body of research in Australia. Alison has made quite an unexpected discovery. You'd think if you went to hospitals, everything would be beautiful and clean, the hospital environment. Maybe it's not unexpected if you've worked in hospitals, but Alison and her colleagues have found that unfortunately the cleanliness of hospitals actually leaves a lot to be desired. And so Alison has implemented a randomised trial in which she's engaging with hospital cleaners. It's not necessarily the head of surgery who has an influence on the transmission of antibiotic resistance. If we've got cleaners who aren't doing their job, maybe they're not told what to do properly, our hospitals are not going to be clean. So Alison has been working with St Andrew's Hospital in particular, but a number of hospitals around Australia, to put into place this bundle of interventions in hospital cleaning. And the other thing is increasing use of alcohol-based hand cleaning products. So we don't use sinks anymore, we just use alcohol. And finally, I'll give you an example of how these things actually work. You might remember Ariel Sharon, who had a significant brain hemorrhage, went to ICU, and he ended up in a rehabilitation ward in the Tel Aviv hospital for several years before he died. And my friend who works in that particular hospital said, it's crawling with superbugs. But the only person who didn't get a superbug was Ariel Sharon. And I said to him, how was that? And he said, well, not just at the doorway of the hospital were there guards with submachine guns. To get into his ward, you had to go through security. And the security guards were instructed at gunpoint to tell people to clean their hands. And Ariel Sharon never got a superbug. Every other person in the hospital just about did. But if we are compliant with these interventions, it really is going to make a difference. But clearly, many of our advances in medicine would not have been possible without antibiotics. Just think about things like transplantation, ending up in intensive care, even having hip or knees replaced. In all of those situations, we need antibiotics. We're not going to necessarily get bailed out by the drug companies who are going to come up with great inventions. Luckily, this Japanese drug company has, but it's still a trial that we're proposing. So a lot of the action has to be driven by us as healthcare consumers. We don't need antibiotics every time we've got a sniffle. We've got to look at ways that we can sort of structure our communities and our hospitals so that we can reduce the advent of antibiotic resistance.